The heavy iron door groaned, its protest echoing through 40 years of silence as it swung open, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust and sealed history. Inside the vault, stacks of yellowed papers and thick, leather-bound ledgers sat undisturbed, captured in a time before either of the children standing before it had been born. For a long moment, 13-year-old Charlotte Whitmore and her 6-year-old brother Theodore simply stared, their ragged breaths the only sound in the cavernous second-floor office of the abandoned toy factory. Then a shudder passed through Charlotte's thin frame, and she collapsed into her brother, her strength finally giving way. Theodore wrapped his small arms around her as best he could, and they began to cry. Their sobs weren't quiet. They were the desperate, ragged sounds of two souls who had carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. A torrent of grief and exhaustion, and a tiny, fragile flicker of hope that now filled the vast, empty space around them. That sound, the echo of two children's hearts breaking and mending all at once, is where our story finds its meaning. If you are already feeling the weight of this moment, please take a second to let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. Every story we share is a journey, and knowing you are on it with us means everything. Your support in the form of a like and a subscription helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. I can promise you, the path that led these two orphans to this dusty, forgotten room is a story of incredible resilience, and it is worth hearing until the very end. But to understand why the contents of a forgotten safe, hidden away for nearly half a century, could so completely shatter and then rebuild the world of a young girl and her little brother, we must go back. We must return to the beginning of their ordeal, 2 months earlier, to a cold spring night filled with the scent of smoke and the piercing scream of fire engines. We have to go back to the moment a devastating fire took everything they had ever known, leaving them orphaned and alone, and unknowingly setting them on a desperate path toward a truth buried for generations, a truth that held their only chance for a future. Before the dust and the silence of the long-abandoned factory, there was the searing heat and the suffocating smell of smoke. 2 months earlier, Charlotte Whitmore's world had been defined by the gentle, rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks and the scent of wood polish from her father's workshop. That world ended in a torrent of orange and black. The fire that consumed their small apartment above the clock shop was a merciless living thing. She remembered the splintering crash of the roof, the desperate strength in her father's arms, as he and her mother pushed her and Theodore from a second-story window into a blanket held by neighbors below. It was the last time she ever felt their touch. That single, violent act of salvation was also their final goodbye. A moment seared into her memory, not as a rescue, but as the precise instant she became an orphan, responsible for the small, trembling boy who had landed beside her. In the disorienting days that followed, their lives were transferred into the hands of a man named Mr. Horace Pemberton III. He was an estate lawyer whose impassive demeanor seemed carved from cold marble. He spoke in clipped formal sentences that offered no comfort, only facts. He informed them that their parents' estate was insolvent, a word that meant nothing to 6-year-old Theodore, but which settled in 13-year-old Charlotte's stomach like a stone. There was no inheritance, no family home to return to, no safety net to catch them. Mr. Pemberton's gaze was distant, as if he were discussing inventory rather than the shattered lives of 2 children. He saw them not as grieving orphans, but as a legal matter to be concluded, a final entry to be made in a ledger before closing the book on the Whitmore family forever. They were a loose end, and his job was simply to tie them off. The court's decision, delivered by Mr. Pemberton without a trace of sympathy, was swift and absolute. It was a judgment that felt more like a punishment, a final, cruel twist of fate. Charlotte, being older, would be sent to a state-run institution for girls in Boston. Theodore, because of his age and gender, would be placed in a separate boys' asylum in Providence. The finality of it was suffocating. They would be separated at the end of the week. The news didn't just break Charlotte's heart. It forged it into something harder, something fiercely protective. In that sterile legal office, her childhood officially ended, and a new, terrible purpose took root. Her own grief would have to wait. Her only mission now, the only thing that mattered in the entire world, was keeping her little brother safe, and somehow keeping him with her. For the next 2 months they existed in a state of suspended animation at a temporary holding home. It was a clean, cold, and utterly soulless place that smelled of bleach and boiled vegetables. The floors were polished linoleum that reflected the grey light from barred windows, and the silence in the long hallways was heavy and oppressive. Every sound echoed: a distant cough, the squeak of a matron's rubber-soled shoes, the lonely clang of a spoon against a metal tray. It was not a home. It was a warehouse for forgotten children, a place where they were fed, clothed, and managed until the system could decide where to ship them next. For Charlotte and Theodore, it was a purgatory, a slow, agonizing countdown to the day they would be torn apart and sent to different cities, to different lives, to become strangers to one another. Charlotte learned to live a double life. To the adults who oversaw them, she was a quiet, compliant girl, a model of tragic resilience. But inside, a frantic, desperate mind was constantly working. She was no longer a child of 13. She was a strategist, a guardian, a mother. Every waking moment was consumed with the well-being of Theodore. She made sure he ate, even when her own throat was tight with anxiety. She saved the cookie from her lunch for him, a small sweet offering in a world that had turned bitter. At night, she would sneak to his bedside after the matrons had made their rounds, just to watch him breathe, reassuring herself that he was still there, still hers to protect, for one more night at least. Her fear for him was a physical presence, a constant pressure behind her ribs. Their days fell into a monotonous, soul-crushing routine: breakfast at 7, silent and starchy, an hour of play in a barren yard enclosed by a tall chain-link fence, where the only thing to do was watch clouds drift by and imagine they were birds, free to fly away together. Lessons were taught by a tired-looking woman who seemed as trapped as they were. But within this rigid schedule, Charlotte carved out small pockets of rebellion, tiny acts that preserved their bond. She would hold Theodore's hand under the long dining table, their fingers intertwined in a secret promise. She taught him a game of telling stories using only their eyes, a silent language no one else could understand. These were not just games, they were acts of defiance against the cold bureaucratic machine that was methodically grinding them down and preparing to sever their connection. The only physical remnant of their former life was a single photograph, its edges curled and blackened by the heat of the fire. It showed their parents, James and Eleanor, standing in front of the clock shop, smiling under a summer sun. Their father's arm was around their mother's waist, and her head was tilted slightly, resting on his shoulder. They looked happy, safe, permanent. Charlotte kept it hidden in the pocket of her drab, state-issued dress, taking it out only when they were alone. It was a sacred object, a portal to a world that no longer existed. Theodore would trace the outline of their mother's face with his small finger, his touch gentle and questioning, as if he could bring her back through sheer will. The faint smell of ash that still clung to the photograph was a constant, painful reminder of all they had lost. Theodore, at 6, was a vessel of pure, unfiltered grief. He didn't comprehend the legal terms or the geographic distance between Boston and Providence. He only understood that his mother and father were gone and that the world now felt unsafe. He clung to Charlotte with a desperate tenacity, his small hand always seeking hers. At night he was plagued by nightmares of fire and falling, and he would wake up with a silent scream, his face wet with tears. Charlotte would hold him, whispering that it was okay, that she was there, that she would never leave him. It was a promise she had no idea how to keep, but it was the only shield she could offer against his terror. Each whispered reassurance was a vow she made to herself, a promise that fueled her growing resolve. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Charlotte would lie awake and force herself to remember the clock shop. She would conjure the comforting cacophony of dozens of clocks ticking out of sync, a sound that had been the soundtrack of her entire life. She could almost smell the familiar mix of sawdust and metal oil from her father's workbench and hear the soft, off-key humming of her mother as she dusted the shelves. These memories were both a comfort and a torture. They were proof of a life filled with love and stability, a life that had been stolen from them in a single night. The stark contrast between the warmth of that past and the sterile cold of their present was a constant aching wound, reminding her that they had fallen from a place of belonging into a world of profound loneliness. The system designed to protect them was, in reality, a monument to indifference. The matrons were not intentionally cruel, they were simply overworked and emotionally detached, managing dozens of children with the efficiency of factory foremen. Charlotte and Theodore were numbers on a list, case files in a cabinet. Their profound, world-ending grief was an inconvenience, their deep bond an administrative detail that complicated their placement. No one asked them what they wanted or how they felt. No one seemed to see the terror in their eyes. It was this crushing realization that no adult would intervene, that no one was coming to save them, that solidified Charlotte's understanding of their situation. They were utterly and completely on their own. And so, 2 months passed in this grey, featureless limbo. The initial shock of their parents' death had slowly given way to a gnawing, ever-present dread. The date of their separation approached like a storm cloud on the horizon, growing larger and darker with each passing day. Hope, which had flickered weakly in the beginning, had all but been extinguished, replaced by a grim, quiet resignation. They were trapped, 2 small cogs in a vast, uncaring machine that was methodically pulling them toward their designated separate futures. They were simply waiting for the final gear to turn, for the final lever to be pulled, for the day they would say goodbye for what they were told would be the last time. The concrete threat, the one that had been a shapeless monster in the back of Charlotte's mind for 2 months, finally took form on a Thursday night. It was their last evening. The air in the holding home was thick with the usual smells of disinfectant and despair, but tonight it felt different, heavier, as if the silence itself was a weight pressing down on her chest. Sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the old building's floorboards, every distant city sound that filtered through the barred windows, was a tick of the clock counting down the final hours of their life together. Theodore was asleep in the cot across the small room, his breathing soft and even, blissfully unaware that in the morning their world would be cleaved in 2. Charlotte lay rigid under her thin wool blanket, staring into the oppressive darkness, her mind racing through impossible scenarios, each one ending in the same heartbreaking goodbye on a cold train platform. A low murmur of voices from the hallway sliced through the quiet. It was after midnight, a time when the corridors were usually empty save for the hourly patrol of a night watchman. Curiosity, sharpened by a desperate need for any kind of information, pulled her from her bed. The linoleum floor was cold against her bare feet as she crept to the door, pressing her ear against the painted wood. The voices were male, calm and bureaucratic, 2 officials she recognized from the court, their tones devoid of emotion as they discussed the logistics of the following day. They were talking about her and Theodore as if they were parcels to be shipped, inventory to be moved. The casual finality in their words was a chilling affirmation of the system's complete and utter indifference to their fate, confirming that there was no appeal, no last-minute reprieve, no one in the entire world who would stop what was about to happen. They spoke of train schedules and transfer papers, their conversation a dry recitation of the machinery that was about to grind her family into dust. The Boston train for the girl at 8 in the morning, the Providence transport for the boy at 9. The clinical detachment of it all made her stomach clench. They were not children to these men. They were appointments in a schedule, entries in a ledger. This cold, hard truth settled over her, extinguishing the last faint ember of hope that some adult somewhere might see the cruelty of their decision and intervene. The system wasn't cruel. It was something far worse. It was impersonal. It was a vast, unfeeling machine that had processed them, categorized them, and was now preparing for their final disposition without a second thought for the bond it was about to permanently sever. Then the conversation shifted. One of the men sighed, a sound of weary frustration, and began complaining about the backlog of city-owned properties slated for seizure and demolition. He mentioned a particularly stubborn case, a property that had been sealed since the late 19th century. He called it the old Whitmore toy factory. The name struck Charlotte with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Whitmore. It was her mother's maiden name, a name that had always been spoken in their home with a quiet, unexplained sadness. She had never known why, only that it was connected to a part of their family history that was kept locked away. Suddenly, that locked history felt real, tangible. A brick-and-mortar building standing somewhere in the city, bearing their name, a name that was supposed to have died with her parents. The other official grunted in agreement, adding details that made Charlotte's blood run cold. He confirmed the factory had been sealed in 1891, its keys and deeds lost to a decades-old legal dispute. He then mentioned that Mr. Pemberton himself was overseeing the final demolition order, which was scheduled to be carried out before the end of the year. The pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed slammed together in her mind with brutal, terrifying clarity. Mr. Pemberton, the impassive lawyer who had declared them penniless, the architect of their separation, was the same man in charge of destroying a factory that bore her mother's family name. It couldn't be a coincidence. The realization was a sickening lurch in her gut. He knew. He knew about this potential asset, this last link to their heritage, and he was not only ignoring it, he was actively ensuring it would be erased forever. The vague, formless dread she had been living with for 2 months was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused and righteous anger. This was no longer a tragedy of circumstance. It was a deliberate act of erasure. The system wasn't just indifferent. It was being manipulated by a man who wanted them gone, separated, and ignorant of their own history. The quiet sadness in her mother's voice when she spoke the name Whitmore suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was the sound of a stolen legacy, a hidden injustice that had been passed down through a generation. And now Mr. Pemberton was trying to bury that injustice for good by scattering the last 2 heirs to the wind. Her grief, which had been a heavy, paralyzing weight, now burned hot and bright, forging itself into a new and unfamiliar resolve. She pushed herself away from the door as the officials' footsteps receded down the hall, their voices fading into the oppressive silence once more. She stood trembling in the darkness, not from fear but from the sudden shocking surge of purpose. The world had just been remade. The enemy was no longer a faceless system. It had a name. The objective was no longer mere survival. It was discovery. The desperate, whispered promise she had made to Theodore that she would never leave him was no longer a child's fantasy. It was now the foundation of a plan, a desperate, impossible, and absolutely necessary course of action. The knowledge of the factory changed everything. It was a secret, a mystery, and perhaps a weapon. It was their only chance, and she knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that no one would ever give them that chance. They would have to take it. The threat was now clear and unequivocal. It was not just separation. It was the final, irreversible destruction of their identity. If that factory was demolished, any truth it held, any link to their mother's past, would be turned into a pile of rubble and dust, gone forever. The clock was no longer ticking toward 8 o'clock in the morning. It was ticking toward the end of the year. But to even have a chance of reaching that deadline, they first had to escape the immediate one. The 2 timelines, their imminent separation and the factory's eventual destruction, were intertwined. To solve the larger mystery, she first had to solve the immediate crisis. The time for passive waiting, for quiet compliance, was over. The normal world, with its rules and its uncaring authorities, had failed them completely. Charlotte turned and looked at her sleeping brother, his small form a silhouette in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. He was all she had left of her family, the last living piece of a world that had been burned to the ground. But now she knew there was something else, a forgotten building of red brick and sealed secrets that also belonged to them. Protecting Theodore no longer just meant keeping him by her side. It now meant reclaiming a history that a powerful man was trying to bury. The decision crystallized in that moment, not with a thunderclap of courage, but in the cold, silent resolve of a 13-year-old girl who had just realized that the only person who could save her family was herself. She would not let Mr. Pemberton win. She would not let them be erased. They were going to disappear, but they would do it on their own terms. The decision was not a choice. It was an instantaneous and irreversible chemical reaction in the crucible of her soul. Standing in the cold, silent darkness of the room, the fading echo of the official's footsteps still hanging in the air, Charlotte Whitmore was remade. The 13-year-old girl who had spent 2 months drowning in a sea of grief and helplessness was gone, replaced by someone sharp, focused, and unyielding. The time for tears, for quiet compliance, for hoping some unseen adult would recognize the injustice of their situation, was over. That hope was a fool's dream, a child's fantasy. The world had presented its terms. And she was rejecting them entirely. She would not be shipped to Boston. Theodore would not be sent to Providence. They would not become footnotes in a forgotten file. The knowledge of the factory was a key, and she would sooner break the lock than hand it over. In that moment, a new and terrible clarity settled over her. They were leaving, and they were leaving tonight. Her mind, which had been a chaotic storm of fear for weeks, suddenly became a calm, efficient engine of logistics. There was no time for an elaborate plan, no opportunity to gather extensive supplies. The strategy that formed was born of pure desperation, a single, terrifyingly simple directive. Walk out of the holding home, walk out of Hartford, and find the factory. The officials had mentioned it was off the old Boston Post Road, a vague clue that felt as vast and unknowable as the ocean, but it was the only heading she had. She mentally rehearsed the first steps, a frantic but focused visualization. Down the main staircase, past the sleeping matron's office, to the rear kitchen door, which she knew had a faulty latch. The risks were monumental. If they were caught, it would mean immediate separation, a punishment from which there would be no recovery. But the risk of staying was no longer a risk, it was a certainty. The choice was between a terrible chance and a guaranteed tragedy. Action followed thought with a speed that left no room for doubt. She moved with a predator's silence, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. Her first stop was the small wooden crate at the foot of her bed that held their meager possessions. From it she took the one thing that felt like armor, the shared wool blanket, still smelling faintly of their old home. It was thin and scratchy, but it was theirs. Then her fingers found the curled, fire-damaged photograph of their parents. She clutched it for a moment, drawing a strange, fierce strength from the smiling faces that seemed to look out from a different lifetime. This wasn't just an escape, it was a mission on their behalf, a refusal to let the name Whitmore be erased by the grandson of the man who had tried to destroy it once before. The photo was not just a memory, it was a declaration of war, a promise to the past that she would fight for their future. The next step was the most perilous. The kitchen was on the ground floor, a place of bright lights and activity during the day, but a cavern of shadows and unknown dangers at night. She crept down the main staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, each creak of the aging wood a potential gunshot in the oppressive silence. She held her breath, listening for the telltale sounds of the night watchman on his rounds, but heard only the building's old tired groans. In the kitchen, the air was cool and smelled of yeast and bleach. Her eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight filtering through a grimy window, and she quickly found what she was looking for. A half loaf of day-old bread, left on a wooden cutting board. It felt as heavy and precious as gold. She wrapped it carefully in a dish towel, her small act of theft a necessary crime in a world that had stolen everything from them. Returning to their room, she laid her acquisitions on the bed, the blanket, the photograph, the bread. The sight of these three simple objects, their entire worldly wealth, solidified the finality of her decision. This was the point of no return. Looking at them, she felt a profound and silent farewell, not just to the cold, sterile room, but to the very idea of being a child who could rely on others. That part of her was gone, burned away with their home. She was now the provider, the protector, the planner. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over her as the enormity of what she was about to do settled in. She was 13 years old, about to lead her 6-year-old brother into the wilderness of the world with nothing but a blanket and some bread. The thought was so terrifying, it almost paralyzed her. But then she remembered the sound of the officials' voices, their casual discussion of schedules and separations, and the fear was burned away by the white-hot certainty of her purpose. Now came the most delicate task. She knelt beside Theodore's cot, his small face peaceful in sleep, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own heart. He was so small, so trusting. She gently shook his shoulder, her hand cupped over his mouth to muffle any sound he might make. His eyes fluttered open, wide and confused in the darkness. Before fear could take hold, she whispered the words she had prepared, a lie that was also the deepest kind of truth. They were going on an adventure, a secret journey to find a surprise, a place that belonged to their mother. His sleepy confusion slowly gave way to a flicker of excitement. The word adventure, a piece of magic that transformed the terrifying darkness into a world of possibility. He trusted her completely, his unquestioning faith both a comfort and a crushing weight of responsibility. He nodded, his small hand finding hers in the dark. With painstaking quiet, she helped him dress, pulling his worn trousers and shirt over his sleeping clothes for extra warmth. Every rustle of fabric, every soft thud of a shoe on the floor felt amplified in the stillness. The clock in her mind was ticking louder now, each minute bringing the grey light of dawn closer, bringing the 8 a.m. train and the end of their world closer. She wrapped the blanket around Theodore's shoulders like a royal cloak, then put the bread and the photograph into a small cloth sack she found in the crate. She took one last look around the small, impersonal room that had been their prison for 2 agonizing months. There was nothing here to miss, nothing but the ghost of their shared time, a period of waiting that was now finally over. She was ready. They were ready. She took Theodore's hand, his small fingers wrapping tightly around hers, and led him to the door. Her hand hovered over the cool brass knob for a single heart-stopping second. This was it, the final moment of choice. Every instinct screamed at the danger, at the foolishness of a child's plan against an adult world. But the memory of her parents' smiles in the photograph, the thought of Theodore's face when they would inevitably pull him away, gave her the final push she needed. She was not just running from something, she was running toward something, toward a forgotten factory that held the only truth that mattered. Steeling her resolve, she slowly, silently turned the knob. The latch gave a soft click, a sound that sealed their fate. She pulled the door open just enough for them to slip through, and together they stepped out of the room and into the dark, silent hallway, leaving their old lives behind forever. The hallway was a river of shadows, and they moved through it like ghosts, 2 small figures swallowed by the immense silence of the sleeping house. Charlotte held Theodore's hand so tightly their bones seemed to fuse, her every sense screaming with a level of alertness she had never known. Each floorboard threatened to betray them with a groan, each draught of cold air felt like the sigh of a waking guard. They reached the top of the main staircase, a grand, dark structure that descended into an abyss of blackness. The descent was an eternity, each step a calculated risk, their combined weight carefully distributed to avoid the noisiest planks she had mapped in her mind over the past 2 months. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying the faint, clean scent of bleach from the kitchen below. It was the smell of their prison, and with every step down they were getting closer to leaving it behind for good. Their first true obstacle was the kitchen door, the final barrier between their cage and the unknown freedom of the world outside. Charlotte knew its latch was faulty, a small piece of institutional neglect that had now become their greatest asset. But as she reached for the handle, her heart hammered against her ribs. What if tonight was the night it had been fixed? What if the night watchman was just on the other side? She held her breath, turning the knob with an agonizing slowness that made her muscles ache. The mechanism gave a soft, metallic scrape, but did not catch. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She pulled the heavy door inward, just enough for them to slip through the sudden rush of cold night air, a shocking, liberating slap against their faces. They were out. They were standing on the damp grass behind the building, under a sky full of indifferent stars, and for the first time in 2 months, they were truly on their own. The first few minutes were a frantic, silent scurry across the manicured lawns of the holding home, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the building itself. The city of Hartford was a sleeping giant around them, its distant hum a constant low-level threat. Every rustle of leaves, every far-off bark of a dog sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Charlotte's veins. She pulled Theodore close, his small body trembling not just from the cold, but from the terrifying newness of it all. She had told him it was an adventure, but the grim set of her jaw and the frantic pace she set told a different story. They moved from one patch of darkness to the next, a pair of small spirits fleeing a world of rules and bells and sterile, polished floors. The goal was to put as much distance as possible between them and that place before the first hint of dawn, before the first morning count revealed 2 empty beds. They navigated the deserted streets by instinct and memory, heading in the general direction of the old industrial sector, a part of the city she had only glimpsed from the window of a court-appointed car. The urban landscape at 3 in the morning was an alien world. Street lamps cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for them. Every passing car, though rare, was a potential enemy, forcing them to duck behind hedges or press themselves into the recessed doorways of darkened storefronts. During one such stop, a lone police officer walked his beat on the opposite side of the street, his footsteps echoing with an authority that seemed to shake the very ground they stood on. Charlotte covered Theodore's mouth with her hand, her own breathing shallow and silent, as they watched the uniformed figure pass by, oblivious to the two fugitives hiding just 100 feet away. The moment he turned the corner was an exhale they had been holding for an eternity. The physical reality of their journey began to set in within the first hour. The initial surge of adrenaline faded, replaced by the biting cold of the New England spring night. It seeped through their thin clothes, a damp, persistent chill that made their teeth chatter. Theodore's small legs, accustomed to the confines of a yard, quickly grew tired. His steps faltered, and a low whimper escaped his lips. Without breaking stride, Charlotte stopped, unwrapped the wool blanket from her sack and draped it around his shoulders. It was a meager defense against the wind that funneled down the empty avenues, but it was all they had. The scratchy wool was a tangible link to a life before this, a reminder of a home that had been warm and safe. Now, it was their only shelter, a fragile shield against the vast cold indifference of the world. Hunger soon joined the cold as their constant companion. The half-loaf of bread in Charlotte's sack felt both impossibly heavy and woefully inadequate. They found a secluded alleyway between a bakery, which smelled tantalizingly of yeast and sugar, and a silent butcher shop. Here, sheltered from the wind, she broke off a small piece of their stale bread for each of them. They ate in silence, the dry crumbs scratching their throats. It wasn't enough to quell the deep ache in their stomachs, but it was fuel. It was a conscious act of survival, a ritual that affirmed their purpose. As Theodore chewed slowly, his eyes wide with exhaustion, Charlotte stood watch at the mouth of the alley, her gaze sweeping the empty street. She was no longer just a sister, she was a sentry, a provider, a leader, and the weight of these roles was far heavier than the small boy she would soon have to carry. As the sky began to bleed from inky black to a bruised pre-dawn purple, a new urgency took hold. The approaching light was not a comfort, it was a threat. Daylight would expose them, turning them from unseen shadows into two obviously lost and runaway children. They had to move faster, push harder. But Theodore was at his limit. He stumbled, his small body finally giving in to exhaustion. He looked up at Charlotte, his eyes swimming with tears, and whispered that he couldn't walk anymore. There was no blame in his voice, only a simple, heartbreaking statement of fact. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Charlotte. The task was too big. She was too small. But then she looked at his trusting face, and the despair was burned away by a fierce protective fire. She knelt down, her back to him, and said, "Climb on. I'll be your horse. We'll ride all the way to Mom's adventure." The weight of him was a shock. He was only 6, but carrying him on her back transformed her journey from a difficult walk into a grueling test of endurance. Every step was a strain, her muscles screaming in protest. She shifted his weight, trying to find a balance, her arms looped under his legs to hold him secure. He quickly fell asleep, his head resting on her shoulder, his soft breath a warm puff against her cold cheek. She walked on, a 13-year-old girl carrying her entire world through the waking streets of a city that didn't know they existed. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, on the steady, painful beat of her feet on the pavement, turning her body into a machine with a single purpose: move forward. The physical pain was a strange comfort, a distraction from the terror that churned just beneath the surface of her resolve. For 3 days, this became their reality. A slow, agonizing trek from the heart of civilization to its forgotten edges. They moved mostly in the early mornings and late evenings, hiding during the brightest parts of the day in patches of woods or behind abandoned industrial buildings. Charlotte became an expert in the geography of neglect, finding paths where others saw only barriers. She asked for directions only when absolutely necessary, approaching solitary workers or elderly women, asking vaguely for the old Boston Post Road, trying to make it sound like an errand for her parents. Every interaction was a gamble, a tightrope walk over a pit of discovery. They survived on the last of the bread and on water sipped from public fountains, which felt like finding an oasis in the desert. The constant fear of being seen, of being questioned, became a permanent hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. On the second day, their luck almost ran out. Huddled behind a stack of rotting lumber near a rail yard, they watched as a freight train thundered past. The noise was deafening, a roar that shook the ground. When it had passed, a yard worker stood not 50 feet from them, his gaze sweeping the area. Charlotte's blood ran cold. She pulled Theodore tighter against her, pressing them both into the shadows, willing them to become invisible. The man's eyes seemed to pass right over them, his mind on his work, not on searching for two small, dirty children. He turned and walked away, and only then did Charlotte realize she had been holding her breath, her lungs burning for air. It was another near miss, another reminder of how fragile their freedom was, how one unlucky glance could undo everything they had endured. The journey was a physical and emotional erosion. Their clothes became torn and stained, their faces smudged with dirt. Charlotte's feet were a geography of blisters, each step a carefully managed negotiation with pain. But with every mile they put between themselves and Hartford, a subtle shift occurred. The oppressive fear of the holding home began to recede, replaced by the more primal fears of starvation and exposure. It was a terrible trade, but it was a trade they had made on their own terms. She was in control of their suffering now, and that made all the difference. She learned to read the sky for signs of rain, to find shelter under bridges, to muffle Theodore's coughs when they slept huddled together for warmth under the single wool blanket. She was becoming feral, shedding the skin of a helpless child and growing into something tougher, something forged in the crucible of necessity. Finally, on the afternoon of the third day, they saw it. They had been following a crumbling stretch of the old road, the pavement cracked and overrun with weeds. The landscape was dotted with the skeletal remains of forgotten factories, their brick walls dark and their windows like vacant eyes. And then, set back from the road behind a rusted iron fence and a small forest of overgrown trees, was a building that matched the vague image in her mind. It was 4 stories of faded red brick, imposing and silent, a monument from another time. A weathered wooden sign, miraculously still hanging from 2 chains, was barely visible through the tangle of branches. With a surge of renewed strength, Charlotte pushed aside a thick curtain of ivy. The faded white letters were unmistakable. Whitmore and Sons, Fine Toy Makers, Eston 1847. They had made it. They had found it. The sight of her own name, her mother's name, carved into that decaying sign, was not just a destination, it was a homecoming. Finding the factory was one thing, entering it was another. The grand front doors were chained shut, the heavy oak barred from the inside, a definitive statement that the world had been locked out 4 decades prior. For a heart-stopping hour, Charlotte feared they had come all this way for nothing, that their journey would end in defeat on the factory's doorstep. But then, circling the building's perimeter, her hand brushing against the crumbling brick, she found it. A small, broken basement window, its glass long gone, the opening obscured by a thick curtain of thorny bushes. It was just large enough for them to squeeze through. Dropping into the cool, musty darkness was like plunging into another century. The air was thick and still, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and the faint ghostly perfume of sawdust. Above them, the sounds of the wind and the outside world vanished, replaced by a profound echoing silence that felt sacred and heavy, the silence of a place that had been holding its breath for 40 years. They moved slowly, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, a pair of small explorers in a forgotten tomb. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows and hulking shapes that revealed themselves to be dormant machinery, sleeping giants covered in thick shrouds of dust and cobwebs. From there, they found a set of wooden stairs that groaned in protest under their slight weight, leading them up into the main factory floor. It was a cavernous space, a cathedral of industry where time had stopped abruptly. Unfinished wooden toys littered the workbenches, rows of headless soldiers, unassembled rocking horses, and dolls with blank, unpainted faces. They were frozen in mid-creation, a silent army waiting for hands that would never return. Dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the weak shafts of afternoon light that pierced the grime-caked windows, illuminating a scene of perfect, undisturbed stillness. It was not a place of horror, but of a deep, profound sadness. With a shared, unspoken purpose, they sought the heart of the building, climbing another wide staircase to the second floor, their footsteps the first to disturb the settled dust in generations. This floor was different, lined with doors to what must have been offices. One door, at the very end of the hall, stood slightly ajar. It was larger than the others, made of dark, heavy wood with a tarnished brass plate that simply read, A. Whitmore. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Pushing the door open, they stepped into the main office. It was exactly as the premise described. A large mahogany desk faced a pair of high-backed leather chairs, their surfaces cracked and faded. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with leather-bound ledgers, while another was occupied by display cases showing the company's finest completed toys. Everything, from the inkwell on the desk to the globe in the corner, was coated in a uniform, ghostly layer of grey dust. The room was a time capsule of a life interrupted, a business that had simply ceased to be in the middle of a workday. But their attention was immediately drawn to the most dominant feature of the space, a massive iron safe built into the far wall. It was immense, black and imposing, its surface adorned with a tarnished but still recognizable brass crest, the same stylized W that had been on the sign outside. This was the vault, the physical heart of the factory's secrets. It stood as a silent, immovable guardian of their family's lost history. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of determination through Charlotte's exhausted body. Whatever Mr. Pemberton was hiding, whatever truth her mother had carried as a silent sorrow, the answer had to be locked behind that heavy iron door. This was not just a safe, it was a final destination, the end of their desperate flight and the beginning of something else entirely. For what felt like an eternity, Charlotte worked at the combination dial, her fingers clumsy with cold and fatigue. The task felt hopeless. She tried numbers that seemed significant, the year the factory was founded, the current year, her parents' ages, but the lock remained stubbornly silent. She pulled at the heavy handle, her thin arms straining, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration and exhaustion began to settle in, a cold dread that they had come this far only to be defeated by a wall of steel and a forgotten sequence of numbers. Theodore, too small to help, sat quietly on the floor, his small frame slumped against one of the dusty leather chairs. He watched her with wide, weary eyes, the initial spark of adventure having long since been extinguished by their grueling journey. The silence in the room grew heavier, thick with the weight of their failure and the ghosts of the past. Just as Charlotte was about to give up, to sink to the floor in a wave of complete and utter despair, Theodore stirred. He had grown restless, his 6-year-old's attention span finally exhausted by the inert mystery of the safe. He wandered the perimeter of the room, his small fingers tracing lines in the thick dust on the furniture. He stopped in front of a framed photograph hanging on the wall beside the vault, a portrait almost entirely obscured by a film of grime. He wiped a small circle clean with the sleeve of his shirt and then let out a small gasp. He tugged on Charlotte's dress, pointing. "Lottie," he whispered, his voice raspy. "He has Mama's eyes." Charlotte followed his gaze. Through the small, clean patch of glass, she saw the face of a man with a kind but sad expression, and standing beside him, her hand in his, was a little girl with a large ribbon in her hair. It was a ghost from a past she never knew, a grandfather and a mother she could barely remember. A strange, inexplicable impulse made her take the photograph down from the wall. The wooden frame was heavy in her hands, an object of substance and history. She turned it over, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. On the back of the frame, written in faded brown ink, was a simple, elegant script. It was a date. May 18th, 1885. The numbers seemed to swim before her eyes. For a moment, they were just numbers, another random sequence in a world of forgotten things. But then a memory, distant and faint, surfaced in her mind. It was the sound of her father's voice, singing a birthday song every spring, a song for her mother, Eleanor. May 18th. It was her mother's birthday. The realization was a jolt of electricity, a sudden, impossible surge of hope that was so powerful it made her hands tremble. It couldn't be a coincidence. It had to be a message, a key left behind. She approached the vault again, not with desperation, but with a new, fragile sense of reverence. The photograph felt warm in her hand, a connection to the family she had never known. With her other hand, she reached for the cold brass dial. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each turn of the wheel a prayer. She cleared her mind, focusing only on the numbers, on the memory of her mother's birthday. She turned the dial to the right, stopping precisely on the number 5, then left past 0 to 18. Finally, she turned it right again, her breath held tight in her chest until the arrow aligned perfectly with 85. For a second, nothing happened. And then, in the profound 40-year silence of the room, a sound broke the stillness. It was a sharp, clean, metallic click, a sound of release, a sound of opening. The heavy iron door groaned, its protest echoing through decades of silence as it swung open, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust and sealed history. Inside the vault, stacks of yellowed papers and thick leather-bound ledgers sat undisturbed, captured in a time before either of the children standing before it had been born. For a long moment, 13-year-old Charlotte Whitmore and her 6-year-old brother Theodore simply stared, their ragged breaths the only sound in the cavernous second-floor office. They had done it. They had crossed an impossible distance, survived on scraps and sheer will, and had now unlocked the very heart of their family's secret. The sight of the vault's contents, the proof that their journey had not been in vain, was the final key that unlocked everything they had been holding inside. A shudder passed through Charlotte's thin frame, and she collapsed into her brother, her strength, her resolve, her carefully constructed armor finally giving way. Theodore wrapped his small arms around her as best he could, and they began to cry. Their sobs weren't quiet or restrained. They were the desperate, ragged sounds of two souls who had carried the crushing weight of grief, fear, and responsibility on their small shoulders for far too long. It was a torrent of exhaustion from their journey, sorrow for their lost parents, and a tiny, fragile flicker of hope for what lay inside that vault. Their cries filled the vast empty space, echoing off the silent toys and dusty furniture, finally breaking the long, lonely silence of the Whitmore toy factory. When the last echo of their sobs faded into the dusty air, a profound and fragile stillness settled over the room. The moment of release was over, replaced by a quiet, shared resolve. Wiping the tears from her brother's face and then her own, Charlotte turned back to the dark. Open more of the vault. The smell of old paper and sealed time was the scent of her own history, a history she was finally ready to claim. She reached inside, her hand trembling slightly, and pulled the topmost ledger from its resting place. It was heavy, bound in dark green leather, its cover embossed with the same stylized W as the vault door. She laid it on the desk, the soft thud of its weight the first purposeful sound in this office in nearly half a century. It felt less like a book and more like a gravestone, a marker for a time and a family she had never been allowed to know. She opened the cover. The pages were filled with elegant looping cursive, a record of accounts and inventories from a world of steam and gaslight. It was a language of business, of numbers and transactions that meant little to her. But beneath the cold facts of commerce, she could feel the pulse of a living thing, a business that had been built with pride, a family name that had once stood for quality and imagination. She ran her fingers over the columns of figures, a ghost touching a ghost. Theodore, drawn by the same quiet reverence, stood on his toes to peer at the strange, beautiful script. This was theirs. This dusty, forgotten book was a piece of them, a tangible link to the mother whose sadness she was finally beginning to understand. It was the first page in a story that had been deliberately torn from their lives. Atop the next stack of papers sat a single thick vellum envelope, sealed with a dark red wax that had remained unbroken for 40 years. It bore no address, no stamp, only 2 words written in the same elegant hand as the ledger: "To my heir." The words seemed to lift off the page and hang in the air, a direct address across the chasm of time. This was not a business record, it was a message. It was a hand reaching out from the past, intended for the first Whitmore to break the silence of this room. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic, hopeful rhythm against the profound quiet. She looked at Theodore, his eyes wide and fixed on the envelope, and she knew they were standing on a precipice. Everything they had endured, the fire, the flight, the fear, it had all led them to this single sealed piece of paper. With a reverence that bordered on fear, Charlotte carefully broke the wax seal. The crackle of the old paper as she unfolded the letter was a sound louder than any shout, a whisper that had waited 4 decades to be heard. The letter was from a man named Arthur Whitmore, their great-grandfather. As she began to read, the world outside the dusty windows, the world of 1931, of holding homes and indifferent lawyers, dissolved completely. She was transported back to 1891, into the heart of a devastating betrayal. Arthur wrote of his business partner, a man named Harrison Pemberton, who had been his closest friend. He described, in words filled with a quiet, dignified pain, how Pemberton had used forged documents and legal maneuvering to systematically steal the company, seizing control of the patents, the factory, and the family name, leaving Arthur bankrupt and publicly shamed. The name Pemberton struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the same name as the cold, impassive lawyer who had tried to erase them. The injustice was not a recent tragedy. It was a generational crime, a poison that had flowed down through 2 families. Charlotte's hands trembled as she continued to read. Arthur explained that he had gathered all the original deeds and partnership agreements, the undeniable proof of his sole ownership, and sealed them in this vault on the day he was forced to abandon his life's work. He wrote that he had no fight left in him, that the public humiliation had broken his spirit. He had died only months later. His heart, the letter implied, giving out under the weight of his friend's treachery. The letter was not just a story, it was a confession, a final testimony from a man who had lost everything but the truth. She finally understood her mother's quiet sadness. It wasn't shame, it was the inherited grief of a stolen legacy, the deep, unspoken pain of an injustice that had never been righted. Her mother, Eleanor, was the little girl in the photograph, the daughter of a man who had been destroyed by a Pemberton, and now, 40 years later, the grandson of that same man, Mr. Horace Pemberton III, had been trying to finish the job. He hadn't just been indifferent to their plight. He had actively sought to separate them, to scatter them to the winds, ensuring they would never find this factory, never uncover the truth of his family's crime. Their presumed poverty wasn't an accident of fate. It was the final act in a long and calculated campaign of erasure. The realization was a white-hot surge of anger that burned away the last of her fear. Tucked within the main letter was a second, smaller note, this one detailing the existence of something that seemed impossible, a Swiss bank account. Arthur had foresightedly licensed several of his most ingenious toy designs to an international distributor, with the royalties directed to this secret account, safe from Pemberton's reach. For 40 years, the letter explained, that money had been accumulating, untouched and unclaimed. A sum, Arthur estimated, that would now be worth a fortune. It was a staggering revelation, a number so large it was almost meaningless. They were not penniless, they were not alone. They were the inheritors of a hidden legacy, a secret fortune preserved by a great-grandfather's love and foresight, waiting patiently in the dark for them to find their way home. The final document in the envelope was another letter, this one addressed not to them, but to a man named Solomon Whitmore, described as Arthur's last true friend and cousin in New Haven. Arthur wrote of Solomon's unwavering belief in his innocence and his lifelong promise to help should proof ever be found. The letter contained a plea. If his heir should ever find these documents, they were to take them to Solomon, a man who, if he was still alive, would know what to do. It was a map, a plan, a final, desperate move in a game that had been frozen for 4 decades. Arthur hadn't just left them a history of pain, he had left them a path forward. He had left them an ally, he had left them a weapon. The name and the city, New Haven, were a beacon of light in the suffocating darkness of their ordeal. Charlotte lowered the pages, her mind reeling with the enormity of what she had discovered. She looked around the office, at the silent, unfinished toys on the shelves, and saw them not as symbols of failure, but as evidence of a life's passion that had been stolen. She saw the portrait on the wall, the man with her mother's eyes, and no longer saw a stranger but a guardian who had reached across time to protect them. She looked at Theodore, who had been watching her face, trying to read the story in her expression. She knelt down and pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair. The tears that came now were not of sorrow or exhaustion, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. They had been forgotten by the world, but one person, a man she had never met, had never forgotten them. He had believed in them, and he had left them everything they needed to reclaim their future. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began to explain it all to Theodore in the simple, direct language a 6-year-old could understand. She told him about their great-grandfather Arthur, a wonderful toy maker. She told him about a bad man who had stolen the factory, and she told him that Arthur had hidden a secret for them, a treasure map that would lead them to a friend who could help them get it all back. As she spoke, she watched the confusion in his eyes slowly transform into a look of wonder, then fierce loyalty. He was no longer just a scared little boy who had been running from a nameless fear. He was a Whitmore, the great-grandson of a master toy maker, and this factory, this legacy, was his birthright. The story gave him a strength she had never seen before, anchoring him in an identity that no one could ever take from them again. The weight of their parents' death still rested heavily on her heart, an ache that would never fully disappear. But now it was joined by a new feeling, a sense of purpose that was as strong and unyielding as the iron of the vault. The promise she had whispered to Theodore in the dark of the holding home that she would never leave him had been fulfilled. But a new promise was now taking root in her soul, a silent vow made to the sad-eyed man in the photograph. She would not let his legacy remain buried in dust. She would not let the name Pemberton win. The fight was not over. It had just begun. Holding the letters that contained their past and their future, she felt a strength she never knew she possessed, the combined resilience of 4 generations of Whitmores flowing through her veins. They spent the night in the office, huddled together under their single wool blanket on one of the cracked leather sofas. For the first time in months, they did not sleep the fitful, haunted sleep of fugitives. They slept the deep, restorative sleep of children who had finally found their way home. The factory was no longer a cold, abandoned tomb. It was a sanctuary. Its silent walls seemed to stand guard over them, its dusty air a comforting embrace. The ghosts of the past were not menacing. They were family watching over the last of their line. The faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows seemed softer now, a gentle benediction on the 2 children who had crossed an impossible landscape of grief and fear to reclaim their name. They were no longer just Charlotte and Theodore the orphans. They were Charlotte and Theodore Whitmore, of Whitmore and Sons. The journey to New Haven was a stark contrast to their desperate flight from Hartford. With a small amount of petty cash found in a desk drawer, they were able to buy train tickets, an act that felt like a profound declaration of their new status. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were traveling in the open, armed with a truth that was more powerful than any fear. They sat together on the worn velvet seat of the train car, the precious documents wrapped carefully in their blanket, watching the Connecticut landscape rush by. The world outside the window was the same, but they were different. They were no longer running from a future of separation and oblivion. They were moving toward a future of justice and restoration, propelled by the hope and foresight of a man who had died long before they were born. Judge Solomon Whitmore was an old man, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his eyes clouded with age, but still sharp and intelligent. He lived in a quiet, book-lined house that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. When Charlotte, standing on his doorstep, introduced herself and her brother and presented the letters from his long-lost cousin, the old judge's hands shook as he took them. He read Arthur's words in a heavy silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to sorrow, and then to a slow-burning righteous anger. When he finished, he looked at the 2 small, dirt-streaked children before him, and his composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he pulled them into a fierce, protective embrace, a great-uncle finally welcoming the family he never knew he had. The events that followed moved with a speed that was dizzying. The original deeds and the signed confession were undeniable. An investigation was launched immediately, and the full weight of the law, which had once seemed so cruel and indifferent, now moved to their aid. Horace Pemberton III was arrested, and faced with irrefutable proof of his family's long-hidden crime, he confessed. He admitted he had known about the sealed factory and the fraudulent claim his grandfather had made. His plan had been simple and cruel: separate the last two Whitmore heirs, ensuring they would be lost to the system forever, then oversee the factory's demolition, burying the evidence and his family's shame under a pile of rubble for good. Justice, after 40 years of silence, was finally served. Charlotte and Theodore never returned to a state-run institution. They were welcomed into the home of Judge Whitmore and his wife, a kind, gentle woman who enveloped them in the warmth and love they had been so cruelly denied. For the first time since the fire, they had a home, they had a family, they had rooms with soft beds and windows that weren't barred. They had meals at a shared table filled with conversation and laughter. The simple, profound comforts of a normal childhood, which had been stolen from them, were slowly, carefully returned. The nightmares of fire and falling began to fade, replaced by dreams of a future that was no longer a terrifying unknown, but a landscape of bright, open possibility. With the recovered funds from their great-grandfather's secret account, a plan began to form, a purpose that gave meaning to their entire ordeal. The factory, their factory, would not be sold or left to decay. They would bring it back to life. Over the next 2 years, the Whitmore & Sons toy factory was painstakingly restored. The dormant machinery was cleaned and oiled. The broken windows were replaced, and the faded sign was repainted in bright, hopeful colors. In 1933, the factory reopened, its great steam whistle blowing for the first time in over 4 decades. But its mission was new. Guided by Charlotte's vision, the company dedicated itself to manufacturing the highest quality wooden toys. Not for profit, but for donation. Every rocking horse, every soldier, every doll was destined for an orphanage somewhere in New England. Charlotte, even as a young woman, ran the company with a quiet determination that commanded respect from everyone she met. Theodore, growing up surrounded by the tools and designs of his great-grandfather, discovered he had inherited Arthur's gift. He became the factory's head craftsman, his hands able to bring the most intricate designs to life. They worked side by side for the rest of their lives. 2 orphans who had been saved by a message in a bottle, now spending their days creating small pieces of joy for children who, like them, had been forgotten by the world. They transformed the factory from a symbol of their family's deepest pain into a lasting legacy of hope, ensuring that thousands of children who had nothing would always have something beautiful, something crafted with love, to hold in their hands.